Thought it'd be fun to take a look at the vehicles that Panzer Commander features. Given when it was made, there's quite a variety. It even gives like more modern games kind of a run for their money for the vehicle variety. And most of them are actually controllable by the player, which is pretty much any of the tank or tracked vehicles are controllable by the player, which is pretty cool. So German side, you got standard Opel Blitz truck. Some of these things are modeled to various degrees of accuracy. Again, you got to kind of keep in mind when this game was made and the hardware restraints they were working with. Good old 8 rad. SDK said 231. Your good old classic SDK said 251-1. It is interesting how in this game and a lot of games since, they model the 251 but don't model the 250. And I believe the 250 was actually the more common half track. So that's kind of interesting. It's kind of cool to see the Panzer 38T in here. This is not a common tank to see modeled in a lot of tank sims. Although, to be fair, there aren't that many World War II tank sims. But this was a really important tank early war for Germany, so it's kind of cool to see it modeled. They do have a desert paint scheme for it here, which I thought was kind of interesting, because I'm not sure Panzer 38s were ever actually in Africa. I might have to look that up, but they were definitely in Russia and France, so it's cool to see that. Good old Panzer III. This is an earlier version with that's a 37mm on that one. The Panzer IIIs are modeled okay, like the actual 3D models. Proportions look a little bit off, but not horribly egregious. The Panzer IVs, I think, are a little worse for model. They look a little squished. A little elongated, but again, not terrible. You can look at this and absolutely tell it's a Panzer IV. And they've got quite a few variants of these. This is the Ofs D, which was probably the most common one up to about mid-1942 when they started replacing the short 75s with the long 75s. Early version of the Sturmschütze 3, which is kind of cool to see. Again, not a common variant modeled in World War II tank games. Panzer 3G, a bit of a newer version of the Panzer III. Most of these are going to have just kind of changes in the armor. This game does feature a decently complex armor simulation, more than you'd think. This was another really neat one to see modeled. Panzer 35S is what the Germans called it. This was actually modeled on the Smua S35, which was a French tank in use shortly before World War II and during the invasion of France. The Germans used captured ones for kind of garrisons and training. And at the time, this was actually one of the best tanks in the service. Kind of had a weak gun and only a one-man turret, which was really kind of hampered it. Although his gun was a 47mm, which could still defeat anything Germany had in service at the time. But it was a complete two-piece cast hull, and it had a few other features on it that other nations wouldn't start implementing into their tanks for a few more years. So it was a really kind of advanced tank for the time, and it's really cool to see it. They also right here, because we're just looking at German tanks, looking at the German paint schemes, but they also have they also have paint schemes for the French and Polish for these tanks too, which is pretty cool. Another variant of the Panzer III, and we're just kind of getting a little later on the Panzers. So the Panzer IV F1, with which was the last variant with the short 75mm. Panzer IIIJ, which I believe was the last version of the Panzer III, and this one here had the long 50mm. These were available January 1942. These are definitely a later one, but again, this tank January 1942 was still a very, very good tank. Could keep up with anything anyone else was fielding, except for maybe the T-34s and KVs. So again, kind of nice to see, just this variety of armor in here. Panzer IV F2, so this was the first version of the Panzer IV with the longer 75mm gun. Martyr 2, neat little tank destroyer. You see these in a lot of games, model them. So it's just cool to see, tank destroyers in there. Stug 3, again, Sturmschütze. This is one place where they did kind of make an error in the model. This one here is definitely modeled on the Panzer IV model. It's got the 8 road wheels instead of the 6. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, yeah. So the model actually looks more like an STUG4 rather than an STUG3, but, I can, again, kind of forgive some of that, given the time this game was made. Oh, so they have the Panzer IIIL as well. Another variant of the Panzer III. Panzer IV-G. And yeah, the Panzer IV models still look a little out of proportion, but they're not terrible by any means. Good old Venerable Tiger. Tiger looks decently well modeled. I mean, it's basically a box on wheels, or sorry, on treads. Kind of hard to not model well. And now we're into, you got your African schemes. If memory serves, these first served in Tunisia in Africa. And you got your more kind of European desert scheme, and then winter, of course. So Tiger E. This is another one that's not commonly seen modeled, the STU H-42, which was based on the Sturmschütze 3, except it had, if I recall, it's 105mm howitzer in it, rather than the anti-tank gun. So again, not a common one to see, but it's nice to see it in the game. Another variant of the Panzer IV, late variant. Panther OS-D, the first production version of the Panther. Of course, you're not going to have a tank game, especially not one called Panzer Commander, without the Panther. But of course, by 44, 45, this was one of the most numerous tanks in the Panzer arm. I think in Normandy, these made up about 25% of the Panzers there. So much more common tank later in the war. So of course, you're going to see it. The A was the second version of the Panther. Yeah, the D came out before the A. The model here is the same. If I recall, the A just had a couple of superficial differences, like some minor equipment differences, and I believe it also had a chunk of metal below the mantlet to fix the shot trap issue. But that's not modeled on this 3D model. 234. Back to another armored car, the 234, which was very similar to the 231. I can't remember what the differences were, actually, off the top of my head. They're based on the same chassis, though. And, of course, King Tiger, Royal Tiger, whatever you want to call it. Basically a giant panther. Very cool to see the Panther. Or that Panther. Tank destroyer. Interesting choice on the color schemes, though. But again, another cool, like I said, cool thing about this game is these are playable by the player, which is really cool. And then the Panther G, so this was the last production version of the Panther. Again, 3D model is likely the same as the other ones. This is another neat little one you don't often see in World War II tank games, is the Hetzer, based on the Panzer 38. Very small, little compact tank destroyer. Panzer IV-J with the, I'm going to murder this word, Schutzen, the side skirts. On the tank, they didn't do the side skirts on the turret. I suspect that was probably to make modeling easier. And back to the Opal. Soviet vehicles are pretty well modeled as well. You can easily tell what they all are. Yeah, BT-5, BT-7, very important early war Soviet tanks. Important numerically anyway. BT-7A. Again, not that common to see modeled, so nice to see in the game. BT-8, very rare to see BT-8s modeled. Studebaker. I do believe all these truck models for the Soviet, American, and British are actually using the same 3D model. They just changed the skin on them. BA-10 armored car. You do see that in a few games. It's cool to have it. Nice little sport vehicle. So this is a KV. Pretty decent model of the KV. Looks a little chunky, but again, that's, you know, due to modeling limitations at the time. But is quite clearly a KV, and it is neat that, you know, they still got the text and everything on the side of it. So it does look imposing, even in this ancient model, so fairly well done there. A lot of T-34 variants, and the T-34 models are pretty good too. But to be fair, T-34 is a pretty easy tank to get the basic shape down. It doesn't really have a lot of weird parts on it or anything. So again, very clearly a T-34. Different camos there. And a lot of different versions. You know, model 42, 43. Most of these are just going to be armor differences. You just see kind of just the armor's changing there. Weight change a little bit, which affects how the tank handles in the game. Later model of a KV. KV-1S. Again, not one you see commonly modeled. So it's kind of cool to see that in the game. SU-122, self-propelled gun. A lot of the SU models in this do use the same 3D model, like the 122 and the 152. Yeah, they were very, very similar. You know, the gun barrels were a little bigger on them, but again, given the limitations they were under when they made this, understandable. Certainly not going to fault a game made in 1998 for that. This one was interesting to see. The KV-85. And is modeled differently. It's got a different turret on it. If I recall, there were less than 200 of these built. So it is a interesting choice to see included in the game. But again, decent model. You can tell it's definitely different than the KV. The KV-1, KV-1S, which is cool. SU-85 tank destroyer. Pretty standard, you see those a lot. IS-2s. Again, not commonly featured. It's a pretty OP tank. Saying, yeah, a 122mm gun. Absolutely beast of a tank. Again, not too common to see it modeled, so pretty cool to see it in the game. Decent model as well. Looks very similar to the KV, because it was based on the KV. T-34-85, 1944 model. Yep, so again, if you notice the turret looks, I think it's the same turret that's on the KV-85, which it would be because it was the same turret, or at least a very similar turret. SU-100 tank destroyer, and back to the BT-5. So very nice selection of Soviet armor in this, which is cool to see. A few variants, like I said, the BT-8, very rarely seen in games, especially sim games, so that's pretty cool. We go over to our Americans. Start with the GMC truck. I'm pretty sure this is the same model as the Studebaker for the Soviets. You know, game of this age, this caliber. Yeah, I'm not really going to fault them for that. Good old M2. Can't have Americans in game without the M2 half-track. I should check to see if there's actually Soviet skins for this too, because the Soviets did make use of them as well. M3 Stuart. They have a few Stuart variants in here, where in the FAQ for one of the patches where they added them, they made a note saying that, yeah, the stats are absolutely correct, so all this stuff's correct, but the model itself doesn't represent the correct, the actual tank model. Again, very similar, although the M3 and the M5 were very, very different. You could definitely tell a difference, but pretty sure in here it's the exact same model used for both. Again, not a huge deal, but you know, if you're really, really looking for hyper accuracy, there's probably better games served. Good old classic M4A3. Not a huge variant of interesting paints for that. The M10 tank destroyer. M3A3, slightly later variant of the M3. M8 Greyhound, neat to see these modeled. Unfortunately, yeah, wheeled vehicles, I'm pretty sure, are not drivable in this game. But it is still kind of cool to see it. M5 A1. I'm just curious if we go back to the M3, yeah. Yeah, so these look roughly like the same model. So stats-wise, it is correct, but it's the M3 model. But still, nice to see some American light tanks, especially the earlier war stuff. This is kind of a neat one to include, the M16 half-track with the quad anti-aircraft guns on it. Again, don't often see those in games, so kind of cool. The E2 Jumbo. Some neat different Sherman variants. It's the 76mm armed Sherman. What did Jumbo have on it? Oh, it's, yeah, standard 75. The M36 tank destroyer. Definitely not one that you see modeled very often. So again, really nifty to see that in there. Yeah, they did some texturing inside the turret there too, which is cool. The E2 Jumbo with the 76mm gun. Probably uses the same paints. The M18 Hellcat, really neat to see this. As again, not commonly modeled. Speed 80 kilometers an hour, yeah. I do believe the M18 was the fastest tracked armored vehicle in World War II, or if not very, very close. So pretty cool to see the tank destroyers. Basically no armor though. Think, you know, basically covered in tin foil. But still, very nice variety of tank destroyers in here. Yeah, the good old Easy 8 Sherman with the VVSS suspension, 76mm armed. They have some African color schemes, I think. That's what that is. No, that'd be European. I don't think the E8s were ever in Africa. M24, another light tank, not commonly seen in computer games. So again, really, really cool to see. Some cool camouflage for that one too. And of course the M26 Pershing. I think every nation in this got a nice big bad boy. You got the Tiger II for the Germans, you got the IS-2 for the Soviets, and then you got M26 for the Yanks. Can't really comment too much on the model because the Pershing's not one I'm really that familiar with, but looks unique enough to me. Proportions still look a little odd for most of these vehicles, but again, I think that's largely a polygon limit or something that they're dealing with there. And that should be the last one, yep. So I go over to Brits. So again, you can see these are the same model. The Bedford and the GMC. They just changed the texturing on it. Brand carrier. Always gotta have Brand carriers around. Always nifty little vehicles. So this one, So it's supposed to be the A-13 cruiser. They used the model of the Crusader for this. Well, the A-13 and the Crusader did look somewhat similar. That this is their Crusader model. So that's a little disappointing. That it is like I can forgive the M3s and the M5 Stuarts because they are at least same kind of lineage, but the Cruiser A-13 does look side by side. It looks somewhat different than the Crusader, so that's a little annoying. But if I recall, this one was added later in a patch anyway. It wasn't in the original 1.0 release. But again, it has the correct stats for the tank, so give it that. This one here, unfortunately, I think is the most disappointing model in the game. This really does not look like a Matilda 2. It's fine from about here down, but the rest of this is just looks wrong. And I'm not sure why it was modeled like this, because they certainly got some of the other ones correct. But the turret looks too big. It's too far back. The turret on the Matilda should sit more up here. So yeah, this is unfortunately a pretty disappointing model of the Matilda. Weird choice of color schemes too for it. So yeah, the Matilda's kind of disappointing, but again, they got the stats accurate, so you can give them that. Speed 22 kilometers an hour. Not sure the Matilda was that fast. It was it was probably close, but yeah, a little disappointing on that model. Crusader 1. Yet numerically, the most important tank for the British had in the early part of the war in Africa. Model's pretty accurate. There's a couple of parts on it, like the driver had a little cutout here. There's also a little machine gun turret here. All those machine gun turrets were usually removed, but this isn't even on the texture, which I thought they could have done. The general shape's okay, but yeah, it's not bad. And Crusaders had the 40 millimeter. Daimler armored car, pretty accurate. Again, the proportions seem a little odd. It seems a little kind of squished and wide, much in the same way the Panzer IV did. But otherwise, nice to see it in the game. Valentine. This model is actually pretty decent. It looks like a Valentine tank. The wheels are the wrong size. The front and back ones should be a little bit larger, but again, that's something I'll forgive them. I'm trying to keep the models, I guess, a little more workable. Even then, it's still cool to see a Valentine tank. Especially an earlier variant, the Valentine 2. And that one there's nice with the more common kind of paint scheme the British had in Africa. I haven't checked to see if this one actually is Russian paint schemes. Churchill. Whoops. Not much to say there. Yeah, it's nice to see a Churchill. Churchill 2, so this will be one of the early ones with the 40mm gun. So that's the British 2-pounder, which was fine. 1939, 1940, maybe charitably early 1941, it was an okay gun. But after that, it quickly kind of got outclassed. Stuart 1. So this is the Stuart model with the Desert Rats paint on it, which is pretty cool. Valentine 9, so later version of the Valentine. This one here had the uprated 6-pounder, but also only had a 2-man turret, which kind of sucked. Crusader 3, so this was the uprated Crusader with the 6-pounder, which was it was an okay anti-tank gun. The 6-pounder stayed at least moderately competitive throughout the war. Couldn't take on the heavier German tanks like the Tiger or the Panther from the front, but if I recall, the 6-pounder had roughly the same armor penetrating capability as the 75mm on the M3 Grants and the M4 Shermans when firing AP rounds. The problem with the 6-pounder is the same problem they had with the 2-pounder, is they had a pathetic HE shot. That's high explosive. So that was their biggest downfall. It was really a problem with the Crusader once. I believe they made an HE round for the 2-pounder, but it was never issued because it was pathetic, which is why so many of them were destroyed in Operation Crusader by anti-tank guns. They really had no way to take them out. But anyway, so it's nice to see, though, a couple of variants of the Crusader, both the earlier and later ones. Later version of the Churchill. That one, there's the upgunned with the 6-pounder. Again, and I mean, this thing's just a beast for armor. This thing's got more frontal armor than a Tiger. It's awesome. It's nice to see the Churchill in a game. Another Stuart. Of course, you got the Cromwells. Numerically, probably the most important British tank in Normandy. Interesting choice for the paint schemes on these, though. Which is funny. Like, this is something I'd expect to see on a tank in Africa, but the Cromwells never served in Africa because the African campaign was over by the time they were introduced. But anyway, it's nice to see it. So the Cromwell ones, this is the earlier one with the 6-pounder. Valentine 10, 6-pounder. These are all just different variants of the tanks. Stuart 6. A lot of variants of the light tanks. So it's nice to see a game with light tanks. Cromwell, later variant. This one, I'm not sure what the difference is between the 1 and the 3, because that one still is the 6-pounder. Sexton. You do see this in games frequently. The M7 isn't here. The M7 Priest for the Americans is not in here, which is actually a little surprising. It's another, actually, one of the British tanks that is not in here is the M3 Grant. I thought it was interesting to have variants of so many tanks that served in Africa, but not have the M3 Grant. Because they were used quite extensively by the British in Africa, so... but, you know, again, given the amount of tanks in here, I'll give it that. And then, yeah, you got, you know, a lot of different British variants of the Shermans. Cromwell 4. That's the one that has the 75mm. So the 75mm they put in this was really just the 6-pounder that was bored out to 75mm and adapted to fire the American ammunition. Performance was slightly inferior to the true 75 that the Shermans were using, but it was close enough. More importantly, it actually gave them a good HE round. Firefly, yeah, of course you gotta have the Fireflies. So those are just neat tanks. Again, interesting camo patterns it chose for these. Another later version of the Cromwell, Cromwell 7. Yeah, so that one entered a little later, right before D-Day. A lot more armor on that. So this would have been the one with the spaced armor they had on it and the additional plates. The M10 Achilles. So this was the British version of the M10 mounting the 17-pounder with the same one on the Firefly. Again, nice to see it in a game. Comet. One very rare to see in computer games is the Comet, which was a later development of the Cromwell, which was mounting the 17-pounder. And still a fairly quick tank. And then, of course, this is the big boy that the British get, is the Centurion, which I can't remember if they shipped into Europe. If they did, it was like a couple of days before the war ended. Yeah, available May 1945, yeah. And again, weird choice of camo. But cool thing about this, so at least let you do some, if you want to edit some later fictitious scenarios. that, where the war extended a little bit. You certainly got the equipment to do it. And I think that does it for the British. Yeah, so that's the variety of vehicles in this. And again, for a game that came out in 1998, and given the depth that it models these vehicles at, like on the simulation side, that's pretty decent. There's very few other games unmodded that give you that breadth of equipment to use. So, very cool. Another very neat thing about Panzer Commander.